My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by a man that I met initially in Beyond Limits, and we were talking about pain science and barbell medicine. That man is Zach Robinson. Zach, how you doing?
Doing well, Josh. How's it going?
I'm doing well. We hopped on the call initially, and you started talking. I was like, I didn't remember his voice being that deep. I don't know if he just actually matured in grad school, or like he came into his own, or what. But yeah, it was nice to hear from you. I mean, it's nice hearing from you, and obviously recording this podcast is an extension of that. But I know we've kind of touched base a few times since those, deep philosophical and somewhat existentially, influenced conversations in Beyond Limits. But I feel like there's a lot of catching up to do. And for the listeners, I know we've kind of had some exposure here and there to the work you're doing with Josh and Jake over at Data Driven Strength and Drake as well. So I'd love to kind of catch people up and for you to give them kind of an A to Z on where you've been and what you've been doing. And then we can reserve more of your recent work for the meat of the conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the last time we spoke, we kind of were talking about some periodization stuff when I was in my master's. So since then, I have graduated from my master's at FAU and started the PhD program down here. So I am close to finishing. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel of my PhD. So in the meantime, done quite a bit of research on different topics, proximity to failure. Now my PhD is primarily focused on researching and improving the methodology to investigate individual responses to resistance training. So that's kind of the meat and potatoes of my PhD and what I've been focusing on for the last couple of years. Put a lot of content out on data-driven strength as well during that time. So just kind of been, in the bunker trying to get to the end of this PhD and finish up. I can't remember what it was. Maybe is it 22nd grade? I can't remember something like that. I can't totally recall what grade I'm in, but yeah, I'm getting to the end of the tunnel here, so I'm excited to finish up. But other than that, just been teaching, doing research, and hopefully we'll be able to have the piece of paper in my hand here in a couple of semesters.
Yeah, one that might find its way to a drawer somewhere and pulled out every decade or so to kind of reflect on it and think about, I should really get a frame for this.
Exactly.
So there are a couple questions I'd like to discuss and a few topics, and I think more so out of personal interest with Data-Driven Strength. That's a company you guys have been developing for, I really don't know how long, but it seems like it's been quite a while. The thing that interests me is I kind of see you as, not in like a similar cohort, but kind of at a similar place in terms of you kind of start with a really deep interest in training. You contour your interest academically and professionally to kind of match that. And then along the way, you also kind of develop things related, and then you end up, building a coaching business or whatever it is, and you create content related to, and you kind of see those natural extensions develop. As far as data-driven strength goes, how has that been building it along with Josh and then bringing other guys on? What's that process been like? And I think one of the most important questions would be, what have you learned? And then what advice would you give to people who are in similar situations somewhere along the way?
Man, that's a good question. I don't know if I've answered this before.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
So I mean, what has it been like? It's been a journey, I think is the cliche answer there, but that's really the best way to describe it. So I initially kind of started things back when I met you. And so that would have been, what year would have that been? Like 2016, 2017, something like that. Met Josh shortly after that. And I will say this on the front end and cannot underline it enough. This would be nowhere without him. We are very much a good team. I think we have polar opposite personalities in some ways and pretty similar ones in others. But yeah, we definitely have a cohesive ship, and he is a much needed waypoint for me. A lot of the time I'm a little bit more, I don't want to say I'm a creative because that sounds, I don't know, congratulatory a little bit, but I'm more kind of that spacey thinker, tinkerer kind of person. And Josh is a lot more systematic and concrete and can really, really good at systematizing things and things like that. So we very much are symbiotic in the relationship. So that's been, a really good kind of, another cliche kind of a marriage over time, as we've kind of learned what we do well, what we don't do well, how to continuously take steps forward. And I guess, the major thing I've learned over time, just kind of doing this, is just the more that we focus on putting out as best the quality of work as we possibly can, over time, good things have seemed to happen. And I think, when you get busy and things kind of go through different transitions, over time, obviously we've been kind of doing this alongside with school as we've kind of gone on. That's the guiding light that we've always kind of come back to, is trying to figure out, ways to deliver that content that people want to read, consume, etc. And then just trying to make it as high quality as we physically can, provide novel insights where appropriate, and just think about the problems really deeply. That would be probably the number one thing I'd say that we've learned, and to whatever degree you can measure success by, I guess that for us has what we've identified as something that's allowed us to take steps forward. So it's just been, trying to manage that with all the other things that we're doing. But I think hopefully we've been doing an okay job, and people don't hate reading our stuff is the is the idea. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and one I should probably reflect on more. But it's been an awesome journey. We have a lot of plans going forward on how to continuously take steps forward and continue to provide people value. But yeah, that's probably the biggest lessons thus far.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to conceptualize and truly understand, but when you are like, I mean, these words are so cringy to me, and I don't know why, but when you are a content creator, um, you realize that a lot of people consume your work, and a lot of people end up using that work as some sort of template for their own work. And speaking you is like, okay, you're the person creating content who's handing it down. You're likely not privy to the influence it's having. And then there are all these people kind of coming up who are assuming that same strategy. And you kind of do this when you start working with a coach initially. You think, okay, that's the way I think about programming, or that's the way I program, or that's the way I teach certain movements, or that's the way I kind of operate my business and deliver my programs or accept payments. So a lot of this stuff is kind of learned within the confines of who's creating the work, who's consuming the work. And it's that symbiotic process that allows for the development of more coaches, more online businesses, and ultimately people who are going to further saturate the field with content and coaching services. So I think data driven strength is kind of, when I say at the top, I don't mean like at the pinnacle, but I mean at the top in terms of they're generating a lot of really good content, providing like world-class coaching services and doing all of these things that eventually are going to influence people underneath who are going to come up and try to replicate that or create something similar, maybe with their own spin on it. And you're kind of talking about like, okay, this is what we've learned and this is what we try to do practically from like a developmental perspective. What's your advice to those people underneath who are seeing what you guys have done and thinking like, that's something similar that I want to do? And we had a conversation before this call and we talked about getting into academia, and we have certain people we probably look at as like models of, wow, I'd probably like to do what that person's doing, the way they've structured their life, the way they've structured their work, um, the titles they have, the roles they have. And I think we're in a similar situation with some of the stuff that we do. So to all of the people listening who are also interested in coaching, content creation, but from that, other side of the training space where it's a little more rigorously thought about, it's, I say, quote unquote, sophisticated. I think probably just takes more time and effort. Um, and they want their product or their business to be, the best that it can be. What are your practical takeaways from your now 6-7 years of doing this?
Man, the first thing I'd say is I don't know if I feel comfortable being an authority on these kind of things, but I guess to the extent I can provide anecdotes and I guess my opinions, I'll take those with whatever they're worth. But um, I think ultimately it just comes down to the few of the cliche things is just like developing basic structures, consistency, and giving it like a fair shake. I think that's a big thing that I think people fall off on initially when they want to do something like this is they don't put in the requisite years, reps in, things like that. Like I think one thing Josh and I talk about all the time is like first couple of years of data driven strength. I don't think we missed an Instagram post for, you know, 3 times a week or whatever we were doing each for multiple years. So like stuff like that, I think is the soft skills where that stuff goes a long way. When you're kind of getting rolling and just like giving things a fair shake, would you get a lot of you get a lot of reps, a lot of reps to learn what works, what doesn't work. And you get a lot of points to kind of have success or not have success and learn from those consequently. So that'd be the first thing is just like give things an honest shot and get your reps in. And then the second thing would just be probably realize redundancy is okay to some degree. And this is something I learned a bit more recently is that, initially, you get in the hashtag content space and you realize, like you said, the oversaturation of a lot of things. But I think particularly when people come from different training backgrounds, different language to communicate the same idea, different thoughts and prior held beliefs on a given topic, I think even the same information packaged in a different way is valuable. Mm. And I used to not value that as much, but I do think that's true. Like you could have somebody communicate the exact same concept in 10 different creators do that all in slightly different ways. Some come from bodybuilding backgrounds, some come from powerlifting backgrounds, some come from sport training, all kinds of different things. And even just that micro of a slightly different perspective communicating the same idea, I think demonstrates that redundancy isn't automatically a bad thing. So I think a lot of times people kind of run from that and like try to be shocking, edgy, etc. Whereas, good information is good information and that's okay. You don't have to always look for, the hot new angle on something, right? That said, innovate where you can is the second half to that, right? Is if there is a better way to do something, an easy example with this is just like moving with the social media mediums is like, I don't know, I don't have hard data on this, but the way that people consume content has probably changed and probably has progressed to shorter form stuff, and so that is an example where innovation can happen, right? You take the same information, communicate it in a different way that's a little bit more coming with the times and the way that people are consuming information. That's a place where innovation can occur and figuring out the best way to communicate those ideas given the constraints of whatever the way people are consuming stuff at the time is. And I think you see a lot of that with a lot of the stuff that goes viral on TikTok, etc. I don't consume it, but I've heard. So that's the probably the three-prong kind of, pillars of success, even though, again, I don't feel like I'm a authority on this by any means. But be consistent, realize redundancy isn't necessarily a bad thing so long as it's coming from your authentic perspective and voice. And then 3, innovate where possible.
No, I think that's a really comprehensive answer, and I think provides good insight. And if people have been kind of following along to the development, they can kind of see that mirrored. I think, from my perspective, what you guys have consistently done well is taken, I use the word sophisticated, but like rigorously done work, and then like matched the presentation of it. So it just doesn't feel like it's kind of pieced together or thrown together or kind of like haphazardly discussed. It always has felt like read, digested, reformulated, and then packaged uniquely, like through and through over time, even more so. And I think that's, what one thing that really stands out for me is it always feels like something you'd be, as like someone who would create content. It's like, oh, this is moving up, right? To do something like this would be to shoot up or to move up. And I think that is kind of why I mentioned that you have you have different, coaching businesses or companies, and you have them coaching and creating content, and you have them all along the spectra of like I would say minimally worked on or minimally kind of like put effort toward. And then you have kind of like at the pinnacle, what does that look like? And, you have a lot of companies, we could easily throw names out of people who do really great work. And I think you guys are kind of at the top in terms of the quality of the production and work, the intellectual work that goes into it. And I think that's only growing over time, which is something that, I think it has been intentional on your end, just hearing you talk about it, especially given your interest in training, but then your interest in best understanding the problem of testing and understanding the effect of certain training interventions, which is something we wanted to get into with your dissertation work.
Yeah, no, 100%. I appreciate that. It's a good opportunity to reflect, and it's cool that you can kind of see, at least hopefully, the places that we've learned and try to improve upon our mistakes. So it's a good reminder to kind of look back and reflect on that sometimes. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. And with that in mind, what has been the through line of your work, as early as you can remember, not to infancy, but like as early as you can remember, what has been the through line of your interests, and then how have those changed to get you to a point where you're doing a study looking at individual, I don't want to say individual differences, but individual response to different training protocols?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, I'm trying to think like the first stuff I was really initially interested in. I mean, obviously I've always been interested in resistance training. I think that has been the at least the place to start is, initially getting into research, understanding what it is. You come across a couple sources that are citing some studies about lifting weights, get interested in that, obviously. And then, the interests from there kind of just start. Always been interested in both strength and muscle growth. And then, that has been kind of the foundation of the stuff that I'm interested in predominantly, is kind of the outcomes. So from there, it's ranged a variety of topics. I guess the first concrete interest that I had was during my master's. This was the first time I've been, part of designing a study, carrying that stuff out, etc. And that was the topic of proximity to failure. So from my perspective at the time, and I would say I hold this now, that was a variable that didn't get as much attention in the research, like even just going through the basic, term of quote unquote intensity, in your basic, periodization textbook, et cetera. That's typically referring to the percentage of 1 RM or the relative load being utilized. Whereas from my perspective, that's a little bit contextless without some sort of measure of proximity to failure alongside of that. So that was where I was kind of interested in that. And then you start looking at the training adaptations and how that's influenced by that variable. I think was my first kind of interest in that topic. So I did a master's thesis on that topic, which was a absolute massive team effort study. So I did not want to act like I'm taking credit for that by any means. That spanned multiple generations of the muscle lab at FAU with multiple people, and then there's no way I could have done that by myself. But that was my the project I defended for my master's, and then kind of in the process of that, I was wanting to do some sort of meta-analysis on that topic, which took me a long time to kind of formalize my ideas on how to best do that. But then, recently that has been one of the bigger projects that we've put out there. Was a meta-analysis looking at estimated, and that's an important part if we want to kind of go into that, estimated proximity to failure and adaptations with strength and muscle size. So that has been kind of that first chapter of research was going through that stuff as best I could and trying to provide some decent places as jumping off points for future research, which we definitely need more of in that area. That's more appropriately designed and controlling and reporting the relevant variables. But then after that, and realizing that, both from practice standpoint and just from an interest standpoint, individual level outcomes are really what I think people are the most concerned with is, basically every study you read, okay, higher loads are better for strength than lower loads, for example. People are going to say, well, yeah, not all individuals respond the same, et cetera. You kind of hear that pervasive thought throughout pretty much all of research, to the extent that it's basically some people kind of invalidate it from that perspective and kind of just have the idea that we get to find out what works for you, that kind of thing, which I think comes from a good place and does have some thinking behind it. But ultimately, I wanted to very cohesively investigate that problem for my PhD and how to ultimately do that the best we possibly can. Understand the methods, actually putting in the work to do it appropriately, to see how logistically feasible or infeasible that is. What are some, alternative approaches we could utilize to maybe try to get the 80-20 kind of principle on that to do it well. But that has been the topic of my PhD for the most part, which I recently put out a preprint review paper along with the members of my committee, which was a very big learning project that kind of took me multiple years to understand all the complexities, and I would have not been able to do so without some really valuable feedback from my committee that kind of goes through the methods necessary to kind of investigate individual responses at the way that I think people want to. And kind of intuitively want to assign that variation in response to, just based on intuition, but it actually requires some pretty specific methods to be able to do that in a rigorous fashion. So that was kind of the goal of my first project in my PhD. And then now I'm going and doing an actual study to kind of see if we can, I don't want to say quote unquote prove it, but see if there actually is evidence of individual response variation to resistance training outside of just looking at what I'd call gross outcome variability. So if you take 100 different people and you give them a resistance training program, there's going to be a wide variation in outcomes, but that doesn't necessarily entail individual response heterogeneity to different training programs, which I think is kind of the implication that's often given. And I've even done so before I knew a little bit more about this topic. So investigating that rigorously, trying to see if there's evidence of individual response variability, and then ultimately with some practically ecologically valid tools, can we predict the training intervention that would be favorable for a given individual based on some easily obtainable information for a coach, is kind of the idea of my PhD. Don't know what we're going to find quite yet. I'm still in the data collection process, but that's kind of the through line of everything, if I can recall most of my kind of timeline here.
And for people listening, if you're new to the podcast, which you could be, depending on how successful Zach is in sharing it on social media. But there's a podcast I did with Todd Cashton. I think it was like episode 199, 198. But he was talking about meaning and purpose. So a lot of Todd's work, I think he is a clinical, I don't know if he's a clinical psychologist, but he's in that area of like personality psychology, social psychology. And he's done a lot of work on meaning and purpose. And as he was talking about it, I remember having this like weird euphoria. And when he finished what he was saying, I was like, Todd, this is literally it's information that sings to me. And Zach, when we were talking before this, we were talking about like, how do you find a way to do what you're interested in, given the constraints of, say, working in academia or working in the private sector or working with a business or a company or whatever. It's not easy to do exactly what you want in the capacity you want, in the amounts that you want, and make a good living.
Sure.
And when you talk about training in this way, yeah, I mean, it's the same thing when Todd was talking about meaning and purpose. Like, it's so deeply interesting and so like what I would call curiosity generating, to where as you're talking, I'm just thinking about what are my experiences? How does that compare against what you're going to talk about in terms of what you found, or the literature that you have reviewed? How does that match up? How is it different? Where are some of the holes? Where are some of the spots that it's well supported or reinforced? And it's like really, really fascinating, especially from a coaching standpoint. This is the question to ask: is how do individuals respond to different or similar training interventions? And I think that's relevant because, as you kind of noted, you were talking about the design, and you kind of went over why there are some iterations of it. But you'll write training out for someone, and it's a black box. I mean, it really is. And I know this example has been used in a lot of different contexts in a lot of different ways, and I've used it the same way in many different situations. But it truly is a black box of, here's a protocol, execute the protocol, something happens.
Yep. And
sometimes that's for better, sometimes that's as expected, and sometimes it's for worse, where here's training. Wow, it looks like it's not able to predict successful competition performance. And then huge PRs. And you're like, okay, I didn't see that coming. Or the inverse of, training's been really good and we just really missed, I don't know, you'd have to speculate and say we mistimed the taper, we didn't manage the last few weeks of training well, we didn't create a peak, we more so just created some sort of like, soft performance. So I think that question of how do you create the most effective training for the person, or you create a better approximation of it, is something that's really, really fascinating. Before we get to what you found looking through the literature on what is available for that topic specifically, with the proximity to failure work, I know that, kind of using the example or the idea put forth by Malcolm Gladwell, at least more in like, the pop psych stuff. There's this idea of a tipping point, and I feel like when you guys came out with that article that Brian Miner published on Mayo Journal, there's like this, you could see the swing happening. I could feel it. I was like, oh shit, this is like become a thing now. With all of that work looking at proximity to failure and everything encapsulated by it, I could go on and try to explain it. You're going to do a much better job than I could. But at least introducing the topic, what have you found? What are your thoughts? And the biggest, the most important aspect is like, what are the practical implications?
Sure.
So for coaches listening, how does that influence their prescription of training, knowing that, from my standpoint, I don't really use RPE. I coach mostly weightlifting. Even for the powerlifters, I do coach. I prescribe most things in percentages, and have done a decent job of it. But I'd like to hear how this has influenced the way you operate, so that I could potentially change my practice.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the genesis of this project ultimately, like I said, is I read all of the kind of individual studies on the topic of proximity to failure for strength and hypertrophy for my master's thesis. And I realized that not only was there some gaps in terms of how we thought about the concept, in terms of some different variables that are kind of important to consider. But they're also just the way that that work was meta-analyzed, which is just basically a study of studies or kind of combined to kind of give a consensus of all the research, was limited in how I think it's the most intuitive to kind of interpret. So the goal there was to try to meta-analyze this topic in a way where we could estimate the dose response relationship between proximity to failure and the two adaptations that we focused on, which were hypertrophy and strength. And so basically what that's doing in comparison to the old work is we're basically plotting this continuous relationship between RIR and the gains in the requisite adaptation. Now, the way that it's been done previously is where we have these kind of binary comparisons of failure versus non-failure, or there's ones that incorporate different failure definitions. And it's not to say that work's not useful. It absolutely is. It's just that it's looking at that question in a slightly different way. Now, to give that work some credence, so one of the reasons that it's been done that way is because we basically have no idea how far from failure the groups in a lot of these studies are training, because reporting any information regarding proximity to failure is very, very poor. It's not commonly done, and from my perspective, that's the first thing to fix. And Josh Pellin led a project from our lab where we wrote kind of a call to action review paper in terms of reporting proximity to failure, which I think is the biggest lesson from kind of going through this research, is just we got to be better on reporting this variable if it is of interest, and I think most people would agree that it is. So what we had to do ultimately for this project was we had to go through a series of systematic but inherently subjective estimation procedures where we would go through basically every single one of these individual studies and try to find published equations that would allow us to estimate at a basic level the maximum possible repetitions performed at the given load that they were utilizing minus the actual repetitions performed, and that's going to pop out the estimated RAR for those individuals. And we tried to find the equations that were the best suited for the exercise, the sex of the participants, the concentric intended velocity utilized, the load that they utilized. So we really tried our best to make that as systematic as possible. But at the end of the day, those estimations are kind of inherently subjective. We tried our best and likely are very limited, just because we know that a lot of those relationships are going to be pretty variable depending on a variety of different factors. So it's quite literally our best guess or the best we could do, but I'd be remiss to say it was not without some meaningful limitations based on the way that we had to do this to be able to estimate the dose response relationship. So with that kind of caveat out of the way, what we found is that for the dose response relationships between strength and hypertrophy seem to differ. I'll talk about hypertrophy first, just because I think that's a little bit more straightforward. For hypertrophy, the directionality of the dose response relationship was such that training closer to failure typically leads to greater increases in muscle size. In version 1, the version that got kind of a lot of talk on social media was a nonlinear relationship. And I'll spare the listener all the complexities that kind of go into some decisions with fitting these meta-regression models. But ultimately, for the second version of this project that we've now submitted to a journal, we simplified some things, and the linear relationship, which probably is a bit more conservative, was the one that ultimately fit the best. So that's the one we've rolled with for the second version of the project. But the principle that I think is the most supported to kind of take away from this, taking into account all the limitations of the project, is just the overall directionality of the relationship, which is just that training closer to failure on a per set basis probably benefits hypertrophy. Now, does that mean you should take every set to failure? Is the relationship the same across all loads? No, there's a lot of context that goes into a lot of these things, which we looked at in a ton of different sub-analyses of the relationship. But ultimately, the principle that I think somebody could take away from this project is that on a per set basis, training closer to failure is probably going to benefit hypertrophy, and that's kind of that textbook relationship to show that proximity to failure and hypertrophy are probably linked. Now, for strength, an important thing to kind of note about the way that these models and the estimates are generated is that these were made at a given percentage of 1RM. So that variable is kind of taken out of the equation. So the practical scenario is once I have 75% of my 1RM on the bar, what proximity to failure is going to optimize strength outcomes? And what we found is that there basically is no relationship between proximity to failure and strength. And that is kind of like you mentioned, the hypothesis that I went into after reading all the individual studies. And we made that initial post on MyoJournal, and thanks to Brian Miner for giving us a shot on that we kind of hypothesized, where if we kind of think about the concept of force production and what maximal strength is ultimately testing, which is just, again, your ability to produce maximal force within a given set of task demands. The proximity to failure throughout a set at a given load, which is a very important part of this, is basically just going to decrease your force output throughout a set as you get closer to failure. The velocity at which you're lifting is going to be a pretty tight proxy to that. As the lifting velocity declines as we get closer to failure, that's going to mirror your force output pretty much directly. And so once you've selected a given load on the bar, proximity to failure really doesn't seem to be related to the strength adaptations you're going to see in the typical study duration that we're studying, somewhere in the 8 to 16 week range. So the short to moderate term, I'd say. And so the key thing that I always like to mention here, though, that's really important to conceptualize is that there's two different ways that you can get closer to failure in the context of strength. You can get closer to failure because you're adding more load to the bar. So the repetition is slow because the bar is really heavy, or you can get closer to failure and the bar is going to slow down because you're fatigued. And so in the paper, we kind of called the first one a load-mediated change in RIR, whereas the second one is an intraset fatigue-mediated change in RIR. The former, so lifting heavier percentages of your 1RM, which necessitates a decrease in the maximum obtainable RIR. So I'll just say that in a practical example. If I train with 80% of 1RM, the maximum obtainable RIR approximately is going to be about 7. So if I do a single at 80%, that's about 7 reps in the tank. Whereas if I do a single at 90% of 1RM, the maximum obtainable RIR is going to be about 3 reps in the tank. So in that case, I'm getting closer to failure because my RIR is lower, but that's because I'm increasing the load. So that's a load-mediated change in RIR. That is perfectly supported. There's recently a dose-response meta-analysis by Swinton and colleagues that shows a very strong dose-response relationship between load and strength gains. So that would be a positive way to kind of think about RIR changes for strength. But the one that we were more concerned with is intraset fatigue-mediated changes in RIR. So if I have 75% of my 1RM on the bar, as I'm accumulating more repetitions in that set and I get closer to failure, that doesn't seem to augment strength outcomes. And if anything, if you're taking the results literally in some of the models, going to failure probably harms strength outcomes a little bit, although I wouldn't overinterpret that. For the most part, it just doesn't seem to impact things really. So from a kind of mental model perspective for strength, it would be that proximity to failure doesn't really seem to drive strength outcomes at all. And it wouldn't be a primary factor I would be thinking about for strength in the short to moderate term. And so you can see how, understanding these at a broad level can kind of influence programming. And from a weightlifting perspective, Josh, because I just know you're interested in that, I haven't formally meta-analyzed these, but just from reading all the individual studies, I would say that if anything, the relationship for power and those kind of related adaptations that may be relevant for weightlifting are probably even stronger in the sense that training closer to failure is probably a negative thing, if anything. So that would be kind of where you get the full spectrum of the RAR relationship, where for hypertrophy and probably muscular endurance, training closer to failure is going to be a positive thing for those adaptations, whereas for strength, it really doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. And then for power and probably speed, training closer to failure is probably going to have a negative adaptation there. So that would be the kind of overall scope of that project. And that's really where I would stop. You can get into kind of the mental game of like comparing the exact outcomes that we predicted for given RIR values and things like that. I don't tend to talk about that too much just because of all the potential inaccuracies that are going to come from the RIR estimation procedure. Because we used a relatively systematic process, I'm pretty confident that the dose response relationship directionality will hold up. But comparing the exact effect sizes that we saw and things like that, I wouldn't dig too deeply into that just because of all the different things that we had to do to estimate the RIR for all these individual studies. So like I said, just understanding that overall directionality of those relationships is kind of what I'd focus on and ultimately what we sought out to do.
Yeah, and I know this is always a tough exercise and sometimes one where there's a lot of hemming and hawing about caveat, as Dr. Pack likes to say, terms and conditions. As far as what this would look like in practice, if you could really paint a picture, I think, I recount this experience often enough that it's like relevant. I remember I was working and I was listening to Dr. Mike Israetel on a podcast. And if you're listening to this episode and you like Dr. Mike and you haven't listened to him on the podcast previously, go back and check. I don't remember exactly which episode, but it's called the Mind of Dr. Mike Israetel. And we talked about academia, critical thinking, content creation, and it was just an all-around excellent episode, one of the most popular ones to date. So I would check that out. But I was listening to Dr. Mike on a podcast, and he was talking about programming, and he was talking about it in a way that really helped it click for me. And I remember thinking, I kind of get it now, and I get it more so not in the sense of thinking in vague prescriptions of, well, yeah, programming, we have to do a 5x3 and a 4x6 and a 7x2. But more so in the sense of, I need to have these certain changes over time. They can manifest in different ways. Here are strategies to do that. And it created a better platform by which to write programs. So if you could create some sort of a basic framework or idea using sets, reps, prescriptions, like load prescriptions, and then how that would change across time, I think it would just be a good thought exercise for everyone listening to where they could kind of get a sense or a feel of what that looks like. And then they could think about how it fits into their programming framework.
Sure. I'll give it a shot. So the first thing I'd say is just that obviously this is one way to do things. And this is the academic in me coming out to caveat 17 things before I give something to say. It's one way to do things. I don't think you have to do it this way. It's a way that tends to make sense to me based on my experience, but there's definitely a lot of ways to go about it. Just as a basic example, some people kind of favor a concurrent approach to training. I'd probably format things in a certain way for that kind of approach. Whereas if you favor a little bit more of like a periodized approach over time, I think you could get to a little bit of a different answer there. Maybe I'll try to outline both. So, okay. So if kind of the goal here is to peak for a competition, or ultimately we're trying to maximize strength down the road, the way that I would kind of think about it is early in a training cycle when we're focusing on adaptations that we're kind of, assuming that are going to potentiate our actual strength training, strength performance down the line. That's when we probably want to be focusing on things like hypertrophy, just as a basic example. So the principles of training that are ultimately going to maximize hypertrophy are going to be different than that which maximizes strength, which I think everybody kind of realizes intuitively. For hypertrophy, you probably are going to want to be training higher volumes with exercises that are going to be, very targeted and not maybe super globally fatiguing. So maybe you're doing more hack squat than like low bar squatting, for example. And then where proximity to failure fits in is we probably in those phases want to be taking our sets closer to failure. Now, I hesitate to give specific RER values there. It's probably going to be dependent on the exercise, the loading range, individual tolerances, etc. But as a basic principle, taking those sets closer to failure, somewhere in the 0 to 3 RER range is probably going to be a good idea compared to a strength-oriented phase. So as we kind of go along and get more to these phases where we're trying to maximize strength in kind of the short to moderate term, that's where we can kind of leverage some of these strategies that seem to be a bit better for strength. And that's where I would shift the focus from, focusing on the exercises that are going to allow me to tolerate the most volume, performing more sets, training closer to failure, to kind of looking to maximize the performance of my high load sets that are going to mimic the task demands that I'm trying to maximize performance on. So if I'm trying to improve my squat, I'm probably going to want to, lift a high percentage of my 1RM a couple times a week. That may feature heavy singles, a relatively high percentage of my estimated 1RM potentially on your back off sets. And then for those sets, because training closer to failure doesn't seem to augment strength adaptations, and if anything, is probably going to take away from our performance on those very high load sets that are going to drive the majority of our strength adaptation in kind of that time frame, I probably would try to keep those pretty far from failure. Now, on paper, keeping those basically as far from failure as possible is kind of the theoretical ideal. But from a practical perspective and kind of triangulating some of the other research, it seems, somewhere in kind of the greater than 3 RIR range is probably a safe bet, although that's going to be contextual on a couple different factors. But just as a basic principle, I think kind of trying to keep those greater than 3 RIR for the most part seems to make sense. And then, allowing that to allow us to peak and really maximize the performance on those top sets as we get closer to competition would kind of be the way I would go there. And then, if you were looking to kind of maximize power at the same time, I would just double down on that even further. For a power lifter, maybe some of your accessory work as you kind of shift from that hypertrophy to strength phase, you don't go quite as, crazy in kind of the high RIR direction or farther from failure, because you want to still have a decent stimulus to maintain muscle growth. And there could be some local adaptations that come from your accessory work to help maximize strength as well. So maybe you're not going quite as crazy, and maybe you're not dropping the volume quite as much as compared to somebody who's looking to maximize power, to which maybe you really double down on training farther from failure, decreasing volumes a little bit, and really trying to maximize those adaptations that seem to be decreased with just a greater amount of total intraset fatigue accumulated throughout the week. So that would be kind of my general prescription throughout a kind of periodized plan. But if you're looking to kind of train concurrently, and that's something that makes a little bit more sense to you, which just means that we're trying to kind of train all phases or all adaptations kind of at the same time, that's where I would look to try to kind of find a middle ground with a lot of things. So I would still, try to include some lifting of heavy loads if my goal is 1RM strength. For my, my additional volume work on the main lifts, I would probably stay pretty far from failure there, probably somewhere in the 2 to 4 RIR range most of the time. And then for the accessory work, I probably wouldn't go to failure and everything quite as much, as that might detract from your top set work. So maybe I'm staying most of the time with a couple reps in the tank instead of featuring maybe more sets to failure, more sets with some other intensity techniques, etc., as I'm trying to keep kind of a moderate amount of intraset fatigue to still allow for some muscle growth, hypertrophy, things that are going to potentiate my strength long term, but not have so much fatigue in the system that it's going to dampen my top set performance to a meaningful degree. So that's two potential routes you could kind of go about it. Of course, like I said, there's a ton of different ways you kind of apply the ideas, but using the basic principles for how we think things make sense, that's kind of how I would think about things there.
Okay, I know people listening are going to have to rewind and listen to that a few times. I know myself, when I edit this and upload it, I'll want to listen to it a few times to get a good sense of, you're right, like the general framework, and then individual approaches to applying it. As far as, this is kind of just an aside question before we get into your current work and how that could more or less influence the way people think about training as well. When you create content about a topic, right, because you're digesting the literature, reading it, digesting it, and then rethinking it and kind of applying it within the context of your interest, area of expertise, etc., you encounter a lot of different strategies for writing training programs or ideas about managing training volumes, differences in approaches to skill acquisition, right? So you get exposed to a lot of information. a lot of information, especially when you talk to a lot of different people who have spent their lives studying particular aspects of it. So a great example of this is Keith David, um, who is like an expert on skill acquisition and has done a ton of work on how you can modify training or practice to prioritize developing a skill, or increasing the likelihood that a skill is developed. When you encounter all this information, it's like, okay, how are these things applied in the confines of a program that can't be everything all at once all the time, right? You have
Yep.
to be very selective. Again, you kind of mentioned it, but there are these general principles you operate off of, and everything kind of builds from that principled thinking. When you write a training program, say someone says, Zach, I want to compete in 25 weeks. It's a powerlifting competition. These are my goals. This is my background. This is all the intake information that you need. How are you selectively applying everything not everything you know, but like what you know, and not only what you know, because I think that's the easy part. It's like, oh, I know I need this basic structure or whatever, but deselecting what you don't need to apply, or keeping it constrained to the most likely um, training program that's going to maximize their performance on the day. So, it's a broad question because
Sure.
it's saying, like, basically, how do you coach, how do you program,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but it has to be a process of addition and elimination to some extent, and I'm just interested in how your mind tackles that problem.